Picture this. The early 1970s, and Bob Dylan himself shows up at a friend's door, worried sick. But when that door swings open, what Dylan sees stops him cold. The sight is devastating, not just the state of his friend, but what it represents. The slow, tragic unraveling of one of rock music's most gifted voices. Richard Manuel possessed something special, a voice that could crack your chest wide open. Gospel-soaked one moment, floating into an ethereal falsetto the next. He was the beating heart of the band, that legendary 1960s roots rock group. A piano prodigy whose fingers danced across the keys while his demons danced in the shadows, waiting. Long before a certain pop star put Stratford, Ontario on the map, this small town had already produced a musical genius. Born on April 3, 1943, Richard Manuel seemed destined for greatness. He had everything: raw talent, natural charm, and a gift that manifested early. But gifts come with price tags, and Manuel's would prove devastatingly high. The early years sure, young Richard found his voice singing church harmonies with his three brothers, all very proper and angelic. But when darkness fell, things got considerably less wholesome. While other teenagers swooned over Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis, Manuel hunched over his bedroom radio, somehow pulling in a crackling Nashville station. He absorbed the raw, gritty sounds of Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf like a sponge soaking up water. At 15, he joined a local outfit called the Rebels. Then came that fateful summer night in 1960 in Port Dover. Everything changed. During the Rebels set, Manuel poured his entire soul into Ray Charles's Georgia on My Mind. He absolutely nailed it. The crowd erupted, and so did hitmaker Ronnie Hawkins, who was watching from the audience. Before long, Hawkins was managing them, and the boys were Arkansas-bound, heading for the Southern Club circuit. Here's the thing about Manuel: you couldn't exactly call him ambitious. When Hawkins invited him to join his band, the Hawks, Manuel actually turned him down. He'd made a pact with his Rebels bandmate Jimmy Winkler: neither would leave without the other. Thankfully, Winkler told him straight, "This is your chance. You better take it." So Richard packed his suitcase and caught a plane to Tulsa. Joining the Hawks, Manuel wasn't a complete stranger when he joined the Hawks. Guitarist Robbie Robertson had met him before at a burger stand in Grand Bend, Ontario. Manuel had walked up to introduce himself, but before he could get far, one of Robbie's friends cracked a joke about Manuel's prominent nose. Manuel just grinned and shot back, "Yeah, that's why they call me Beak." Robertson found him funny and charming, but something felt off. As he watched Manuel wobble away, it hit him: the guy had definitely been drinking. Not belligerent, just a little goofy and clearly buzzed. It wouldn't be long before Robertson discovered the full truth. Ronnie Hawkins didn't settle for mediocrity. He cherry-picked only the absolute best: Robertson on guitar, Helm on drums, Danko on bass, Hudson and Manuel on keys. Hawkins ran a tight ship, but about Manuel he later admitted, "I guess he must have had a drinking problem then, but he never messed up in performance, and that's what mattered to me." Richard Manuel didn't ease into the Hawks. Hawkins threw him straight into the deep end. Rick Danko remembered that on night one, a buzzed Hawkins yanked back the curtain, pointed at the crowd, and barked, "Let it ride, son." One small detail: Manuel had never played lead piano before, only rhythm. But it didn't matter. The moment he started singing, Danko knew they had something extraordinary. He called Manuel a force of nature. The wildlife the Hawks were soon firing on all cylinders, especially Manuel. One wild night at Toronto's Seahorse Motel involved a groupie named Kathy Smith and multiple band members. I'll spare you the details, but it was complicated. When Smith discovered 6 weeks later that she was pregnant, it was Manuel who offered to marry her. After all, he'd also been involved. She turned him down, later writing that he was exactly like his singing voice: sad, sweet, and soulful. A little boy lost. If the guys thought life in the Hawks meant substances and wild nights, they were in for a rude awakening. Hawkins ran the band like a drill sergeant, fining members for indulging, banning girlfriends from gigs, preaching discipline and daily practice. Robertson compared it to boot camp. By 1963, the Hawks were ready to leave the nest. Once they left Hawkins behind, the rules evaporated. For Manuel, that wasn't necessarily good news. He was lovable, funny, and wildly talented, but something darker lurked beneath. When he was 17, he confessed he'd already been drinking for 10 years. Robertson later said, "From a very young age, we understood that Richard had a difficulty with booze and addiction. But as we'll see, he had even further to fall." Enter Bob Dylan. Word spread that the Hawks had gone solo, and one of the biggest names in the business came calling: Bob Dylan. Dylan was done with the folk scene and ready to go electric. He needed a band that could handle the switch, and he wanted the best. When Dylan hit the stage with Manuel and the guys, fans expecting folk tunes got roaring guitars and pounding drums instead. The crowd booed, heckled, threw things at the stage. The pressure was so intense that Levon Helm quit the tour, but the others played through the chaos, growing tighter with each show. A trauma bond, if you will. Then came Dylan's motorcycle accident. Nobody would wish him harm, but it turned out weirdly fortunate for everyone. While he recovered in Woodstock, New York, Manuel and the group moved there too, settling into a funny-looking pink house. That's where the real magic began. Big Pink and beyond want the recipe for a musical revolution? Take a group of insanely talented weirdos, tuck them in a house in the woods, fuel them with barbecue, booze, and Bob Dylan's money, then let them loose. No producers, no deadlines, just pure backwoods alchemy. Soul, country, gospel, rhythm and blues, rock, and rockabilly all colliding. The result? A debut album called Music from Big Pink, featuring what would become their biggest hit, The Wait. This was the moment they stopped being a band and became the band. One day, Dylan came down to the basement, handed Manuel a sheet with lyrics, and said, "Have you got any music for this?" No pressure, right? The result was Tears of Rage, the haunting opener to Music from Big Pink. Manuel's pain-soaked voice carried the line "Life is brief" with such aching truth, it now feels almost prophetic. The album didn't set the world on fire immediately. Other groups were rocking names like Strawberry Alarm Clock, wearing Dayglow paisley. The band showed up dressed like turn-of-the-century farmers, sounding like a gospel revival crashing into a roadhouse. Different, raw, definitely far out. Slowly, though, the world caught on. Love and fire with money finally coming in, Manuel started making big plans. By 1968, the band was dodging fame and skipping tours to protect their creative freedom. But Manuel had a detour of his own planned. After losing his license for speeding, he called his ex-girlfriend Jane, the model, and asked for a lift to a family wedding. His real plan? Pop the question during the drive. And you know what? It worked. They married the next weekend. Manuel gleefully referred to the whole thing as a successful manipulation. Things were looking up, but Manuel's accident-prone alter ego soon made an appearance. After a long day in the fresh air gave everyone the munchies, Manuel tried to fire up the backyard grill with gasoline. He used so much fuel it basically exploded, giving him third-degree burns on his foot. He spent the next 2 months sidelined just as the band's career was heating up. The cracks began to show in 1968. George Harrison visited the band in Woodstock and it blew his mind. Compared to the Beatles' rising egos and chaos, the band felt like a musical utopia. No pecking order, no drama, just raw talent and deep respect. "Artistically, I respect the band enormously," Harrison later said. All the different guys in the group sang. High praise indeed. Not long after jamming with Manuel and the band, Harrison released his solo album All Things Must Pass, which he said was influenced by them. Ironically, while the band was inspiring unity and endurance, their own all-for-one spirit was quietly beginning to crack. By the time their self-titled second album came out, Manuel had earned his place as one of the group's creative forces. Drummer Helm assumed the songwriting credits, and the money that came with them would finally reflect that. But when the record came out, Manuel's name appeared on just 3 tracks. Levon got half credit on one. Garth and Rick got nothing. Robbie Robertson? All 12. Something didn't smell right. Levon called it what it was: divide and conquer. Whether it was ego, management, or manipulation, the damage was done. The band's famously democratic spirit, the same thing that had stunned Harrison, was starting to erode. Manuel, the sensitive heart of the group, took it hard. As Levon later said, that's when the great sense of teamwork stopped. Who wanted to pour out their souls and not get credit? Richard eventually stopped writing altogether and started filling the time with more dangerous pastimes. The darkness the band was cracking on the inside, but from the outside, they looked unstoppable. Money was flowing, critics and groupies were swooning, and legends like Joan Baez and Cass Elliot were covering Manuel's songs. Despite rising tension, they kept touring and recording, trying to drown their disillusionment in applause, substances, and just enough denial to keep going. As the band entered the 1970s, they were riding high, private jets and tons of white powder, with big paychecks to pay for it. But the excess didn't fix the fractures. It deepened them. Robbie Robertson would later call this stretch the darkness, a time of addiction, exhaustion, and control struggles. Emotional burnout crept in like smoke. For the ultra-sensitive, already fragile Manuel, it marked the beginning of a devastating decline. By 1973, Manuel was in rough shape. He told friends he knew he was too messed up to work, that he was holding up the band, but felt helpless. His wife Jane had left him temporarily, and a friend was living in his house trying to keep dealers at bay. Even when he hadn't called them, they'd come knocking, hoping for a sure sale. The band had always maintained an unspoken agreement: they wouldn't interfere in each other's lives. But Manuel's situation had become too dire to ignore. It got to the point where even Bob Dylan became worried. One day, he showed up at Manuel's doorstep to check on him. When Manuel opened the door, Dylan was horrified. Manuel wasn't just neglecting himself, he'd let his home deteriorate to an unimaginable degree. His dog had relieved itself indoors repeatedly, leaving the floors covered in waste. Manuel didn't just need rehab, he needed saving. The Last Waltz by 1974, Manuel's body and spirit were barely holding on. A few days after collapsing at a Cleveland show, he had a quiet moment with Robertson. Manuel apologized for his longtime writer's block, then added something that clearly still haunted him: "The plan in the beginning was that we would all write. That's why you insisted we share the publishing equally." According to Levon Helm, Manuel's writer's block wasn't burnout. It started the day Robertson claimed credit for all 12 tracks on their second album. Robertson had reached his limit. He feared Manuel and the rest were heading toward early graves. To close the book, he planned The Last Waltz, a star-studded farewell concert movie directed by Martin Scorsese. But the cameras barely caught Manuel at all. He looked distant, missed a vocal cue on the night's finale. The show was meant to celebrate the band's legacy, but for Richard, it felt more like an exit he didn't choose. Rock bottom post Last Waltz, everyone scattered. Richard lost Jane for good, and his already low self-esteem sank lower. He refused to leave a Malibu bungalow owned by the record company, so they shut off the gas. That didn't stop him. He cooked steaks on an upside-down clothes iron. When they finally evicted him, they found something utterly disturbing: 2,000 empty bottles. It was rock bottom, but somehow, he wasn't done falling. A glimmer of hope against all odds, Manuel lived to see a new decade. In the early 80s, he even felt a spark of inspiration. They reformed the band, without Robertson. Richard quit drinking for a while, married a Toronto woman named Arlie Lidvack, and started believing things might turn around. The road ahead would be darker than anyone dared admit. In hindsight, it's chilling that they called their comeback the Death Tour. Gone were the private jets and stadium crowds. Now it was endless miles between tiny small-town clubs and fading applause. Manuel came to a startling realization: they weren't legends anymore. They were a nostalgia act. "Do you realize we have become these songs?" he told Levon one night. And he didn't mean it kindly. Manuel once said, "I was a party, but by the mid-80s, the party was long over." Even though he was back on the booze hard, there was no fun playing small lounges with bad gear while praying his substance-wrecked voice could survive the set. The final night, it's a long way from London's Wembley Stadium to the cheek-to-cheek lounge in the Orlando suburbs, not exactly a lateral move. After the show on March 3, 1986, Manuel approached bandmate Garth Hudson and quietly thanked him for 25 years of music. Hudson didn't think much of it, he was busy packing up gear. Later that night, Manuel and Helm met up at the Quality Inn where they were staying. Manuel complained about the lack of respect, said he felt like he was slipping. Nobody realized how far he'd already gone. In the early hours of March 4, Helm tried to put Manuel's glum mood into perspective as they watched a movie. The conversation lightened up, and then Manuel casually said he was going back to his room for a minute. It was the last time Helm saw him alive. Without a room key, Manuel roused his wife Arlie to get back into his room. She later admitted he seemed disgruntled, but when he settled in next to her, she drifted off to sleep. When morning came, Arlie realized Manuel wasn't beside her anymore. She assumed he was on the tour bus and went about her morning calmly. But when she got back and stepped into the hotel bathroom, her world shattered. There was Manuel's lifeless body. Her screams echoed through the hotel as she bolted to find the other band members. When Helm ran in and saw the horrific scene, he went into shock. Helm and Danko gently lifted him down and tried to revive him, but it was too late. Manuel was just 42 years old. As Helm later wrote, "Richard had flirted with the Reaper a few times before, and every time God threw him back to us. This time he decided to keep Richard Manuel for himself." The aftermath at Manuel's memorial service, Robbie Robertson was a no-show. But bassist Rick Danko made up for it by singing one of Manuel's most famous songs, "I Shall Be Released," in tribute. As Danko asked the mourners to join in, they did, through tears. The room was full of artists, friends, and family, but nothing could fill the void Manuel had left behind. What broke Manuel wasn't just addiction. It was knowing he'd once had the world in his hands and somehow let it slip away. He didn't live to see the band's 1994 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, but his presence was undeniable. Fans still describe his falsetto as a soul punch. When he sang, you felt it. As Helm said, Richard could hurt you with that voice of his. And perhaps that was the truest thing ever said about Richard Manuel. His voice could hurt you, because it carried all the pain he couldn't escape, all the beauty he couldn't hold onto, and all the promise that somehow, tragically, slipped through his fingers.